Welcome to Inspired Edinburgh, the home of powerful conversations. I'm Elliot Reeves, and my guest today is Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen is a Harvard-educated theologian, culture activist, educator, and creator and principal instructor of the Orphan Wisdom School. For years, you headed the counselling team of Canada's largest home-based palliative care programme, and you were assistant professor at a prominent medical school. Working with hundreds of dying people and their families, caregivers, nurses, doctors, and social workers, you encountered the deep death phobia and grief illiteracy that exists in the West. This motivated you to redefine what it means to live and die well. You're the author of several books, including How It All Could Be, Money and the Soul's Desires, the award-winning Die Wise, a Manifesto for Sanity and Soul, and Come of Age, the Case for Elderhood in a Time of Trouble. You're also the subject of the National Film Board of Canada documentary Griefwalker, a lyrical, poetic portrait of your work with dying people. Most recently, you have been performing your Nights of Grief and Mystery tour, a rich and powerfully nuanced evening woven together by deep storytelling, wandering, and music to sold-out venues across 3 continents. Stephen, I'm truly honoured to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Boy,
that's a list.
It's quite an introduction.
Yeah.
I said to you just beforehand, I've watched many of your interviews and I've been looking at a lot of your stuff, and you certainly appear to have quite a fascinating story.
Well, I've been interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to mix things up a little bit for this interview. I thought for the first question, I would ask you a slightly obscure one, okay. Which is, if you were in my seat, what would you ask you? Or maybe to put it another way, what's a question that you're never asked that you wish that you were?
Wow. Oh, man. Well, what I do in interviews is I try to, I would say, elevate and elaborate the question and the answer. And I tend to answer the question that they should have asked me, but didn't quite get to. You know?
Yeah, I've noticed you doing that.
Yeah. Well, and it's not trickery. It's really, it's coming to an understanding that, somebody stumbles across this, what we're doing right now, and you have the extraordinary privilege of materializing unannounced in the middle of somebody's life, I really try to carry myself with that sense of privilege about it. Well, it's a burdensome thing as well, because, you don't get a second chance to do it. So that's why I answer the way I do, in hopes that there could be some use, for what we come up with. But you've got me on this thing, because it's very early for me. And I had a long show last night.
Yes.
And I was up to the wee hours because your town doesn't like to go to sleep, I notice. I might have to defer on this one.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
No, not at all.
But it's a good curveball, and I'm wide awake now.
Okay, I got your attention.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. One of the things that is almost unnoticeable, apart from the way that you turn up, the way that you present yourself, is the way in which you communicate. You do so with, such precision, and so you do so impeccably.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think, what is the reason for you doing so? So, because a lot of people are quite flippant or quite loose with their
ironic
words.
And so on.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly partly what I just told you a second ago. And, I was, from a young age, I was very compromised in my breathing, and still am. And there's some connection between not being able to breathe and holding dear the capacity to speak in those times when I can breathe well. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised. I've never thought of this, but I'll bet anything these two are connected from a very early age. And then I was lucky enough to have an undeclared apprenticeship with an old black man who was a storyteller in my very early 20s. And he was phosphorescent when he spoke, and constantly. And I think something happened. My exposure to him, he's a thief, and he stole from me 2 things, which everybody in their 20s should be victims of this thievery. 1, he took from me my ability to proceed as if I'd never seen the real thing in a human being. And because of that, his example held me to almost a tyrannous standard, though there was no instruction. If he were to hear me say this, he'd probably say, well, I'm glad you're paying attention, because he never said it.
Okay.
It was by example over a 7-year period, off and on. And then I love the sound, The English language is maligned largely by its own practitioners, which is a wicked chicanery that we perform on the language constantly, And then in the mouths of politicians and pitchmen and hype artists and doomsdayists and all the rest, the language suffers abominably as a result. And I consider English to be an extraordinary thing, but you have to investigate it, because its current incarnations are withered and milked, dry, and so on. So etymology has become a huge part of my school, for example. And the writing that I do in the last 2 books in particular, I feel a literary responsibility, not an idea-driven responsibility, really. All of this combines with whatever, capacity I have, but I've worked on it a lot, I think.
Yeah.
And then finally, when I was with dying people, and they're utterly hamstrung with a kind of contemporary language wherein the realities of what's happening to them are non-existent. I mean, they're full of euphemism and gauze and gas, and they speak about their own dying in a way where the realities of the dying are the first casualty of the way they're speaking about it. And I saw that early on, and that turned into what my real job description was when I was in the death trade, to see if I could craft a language that dying people would recognize they're dying in, frankly. I thought it was a deep moral responsibility that I had to them. And so that's probably where, the greatest focus. I mean, I was predisposed to it. But you can't. Out of the womb, close to it, I suspect. I think my mother read to me in the womb and thereafter, for certain. And I always had the sound of storyness. I don't really have a hypothetical manner, but I have a narrative manner, which is partly the sound, and then it's partly, I think the human memory is activated and deepened and ennobled by stories, not concepts. And so, it happens all the time in your work here. You're trying to remember how the story goes. You just say something, and the something, in a mycelial fashion, starts to insinuate the story that you can't quite recall, and you speak your way into it, which you can never do with an idea. How does that idea go? Nothing happens.
Yeah.
But the story lopes, and as it does, it brings you. So it's a thrill, but it's also a responsibility.
You touched upon, your work obviously with dying people. I mean, how do you possibly go about communicating to somebody the fact, or their families, the fact that they are actually dying?
The facts are the least of it. The truth of the matter is they'd already been communicated to at that level by the time I met any of them. But if you imagine that the reality of one's dying is a matter of fact, this is where the deep misapprehension occurs. Because I can tell you that people, here's a very good example. You mentioned the film Griefwalker. So the first lady who appears in the film, you would have no guess that she's a terminal cancer patient. She's very well put together, and she's in a good state when the filming is happening. I asked her, what's your understanding of what's happening to you? This is literally what she said. Now bear in mind, there's cameras. She knows why I'm here, why she's the subject, one of the subjects in the film, what the film's about. She said, I hope I have this right. That's the first thing out of her mouth. And the next thing she says is, I have terminal cancer, which means someday cancer will come and take my life. Now, the second part of it weeps prejudice and a kind of low-grade terror. Cancer's coming like a predator in the night to steal from her. something that otherwise should be an eternal possession of hers. That's in there. But the first part, I hope I have this right. I mean, how could you have it wrong? If dying were a piece of information, she couldn't possibly have it wrong. But if it's a whole person calamitous overturning of your understanding of life, I guess you could have it wrong. And inadvertently, that's what she was signaling. That up until now, she's trafficked in it as if it were like a monopoly board, you know, and it's not real. And it's just hopscotching along, and appointments and you know, treatments and decisions, and that's it. But that's virtually none of it. But of course, people cling to that because it's a place they can easily drop into. And then they get reams of information. Then they go home and do all that thing, and they can speak doctor with the doctors, but they can't talk human with the humans. And most of it, and then they're adrift on a raft of information that's coming log by log. It's coming unglued as the storm rises, you see.
I feel like the premise of this question is actually flawed, but based on having listened to you speak, I think that I'm correct in the way in which I say it, but we'll find out.
Okay.
What does a good death look like?
Yeah. You know, the beauty of this question is that I get to articulate it from its absence, not its presence, because that was the order of the day. I can tell you what it looks like when it doesn't happen. And from that, you can get a sense of the missingness of something and its shape and its nuance, yeah? Every bad death I saw had a few salient features recognizable from one to the other. One, it was very inward turned. It was very self-possessed. It was deemed to be a possession of the self as well. It was a matter of personal style. It was something that I owned, that I could do with as I pleased, as it suited me, from literally one fitful minute to the next. I was aided and abetted in this lunacy by the people around me who claimed to love me. I know that's a strongly worded way of saying it, but the notion of love at a time like this became a sheet of Teflon, a kind of firewall that the loved ones built around the dying person to see to it that their understanding of love never changed. That's their view of how you serve someone who's dying, that it's business as usual, as normal a life as possible. And the understanding of love becomes a grim refusal to inhabit the time that you're actually in. I'll give you a little example. So the woman's about 28, and she has breast cancer and metastases to the lungs. And I'm walking up 3 flights of stairs, and I know she's never coming down those stairs on her own power. It's amazing to walk towards someone you've never met, wondering if they know about themselves, this little sordid detail that you know about them. And I knocked on the door, and Mom answered. She brought me in a little stiffly, as was usual, and came and sat down, and Mom's on the couch, and there she is, and she has the prongs, the nasal prongs for the oxygen. And I asked her, just after introducing, like right away, what's your understanding of what's happening? She said, I understand I'm seriously ill, but really I don't let it be a big part of my life. And she looked at her mother. Obviously, they basically rehearsed this orientation. And her mother literally did this. That's my girl, she said to me with obvious pride. That's what I'm talking about. Anybody who saw that would see 2 well-adjusted people who have turned a terminal diagnosis into an annoyance. See what I'm saying? That's madness. That's not love. That's co-conspiracy. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So the purpose of the story is to challenge the notion that that's what maternal love does at a time like this. Maternal instinctive protectiveness, yes, sure. I'm a parent myself. But the notion that you will conspire with your child to see to it that your child waits until the last gasp to come to this reality and to live it accordingly. This is, frankly, can't be defended. It can be understood, but it can't be defended as love. So even your understanding of love has to serve the God who has now come through the door, right? I don't say really to love the dying, but I would say that your understanding of love is dying too. That's what I mean. Yeah.
You mentioned God, and I was going to bring this up. I'll do so in, I'll sort of paraphrase a section from a well-known book. Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death speaks about the existential paradox, how we're capable of pondering the infinite, almost making us feel as though we're like gods, but we're housed in these heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies, which we're
It's
worms
a fun
and
guy,
food
Ernest.
for. I mean, it's quite a shocking a shocking thing when you think about it.
Yeah.
What
He wasn't doing well when he wrote the book, by the way.
Okay.
But I'm sorry, please go
No,
ahead.
not at all. I want to ask you what the word God means to you.
It's a verb.
Okay.
That's what it means to me. It's become atrophied as a kind of celestial identity of some strange description, yeah? But I think like many of the treasured words in any language, they have their semantic origins as verbs. It's something that's done. It's something that happens. It's not a kind of platonic ideal, disengaged and never changing, and et cetera and so forth. So that's the first way. It's volatile, and it's not housebroken, right? And it's not that interested in your understanding in these matters. But you could say that probably it's in the nature of things godly to betray whatever would betray things godly. It's people call that trickster. I don't think that's serious enough, or I don't think it brings all the tone into it. But you could say that, the phrase, the John 3:16, for God so loved the world. That's a formulation, okay, and there's it's a proof text. But if you visit the notion, God loves the world, this will help you with your misanthropy, and you're imagining that God and humans are somehow implacable, hostile neighbors, or at least the hostility runs in one direction, or the ignorance, or whatever it is. So to my mind, is there such a thing? Of course there is. There's such a things as God. Generally, I don't speak about God in the singular for no other reason, no dogmatic reason. It's just that everybody's got that market cornered, so that we don't need one. But if you put, this is the same with the word beginning. In the beginning, if you just put an S on it, your imagination goes, oh, more than one. More than one. That's godly, it seems to me, that there's more than one beginning. And it seems godly that there's more than one God. And I'll bet anything that God came up with that. Let's be a multifoliate rose. Yeah.
It's amazing listening to you speak. It's absolutely brilliant.
It's just Canadian. It's a Canadian thing. We're all like this.
I wish that were the case. Why do you think age intolerance exists today?
Well, I would prompt you to finish the question.
Okay.
No, I'll finish it for you,
Sure.
happily.
Okay.
Because I'm getting paid the big bucks here right now. Well, you could say that why is there so much age intolerance among which sector of the population?
Okay.
Because that helps flesh out already the beginnings of the answer, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, there's a lot of self-hatred amongst older people. A tremendous amount of it, actually.
Really?
Oh, an utter refusal to inhabit the time of life that they're in. Largely because when they were in their 20s and 30s, which we're going back now to the 60s, right? In that time period, it was a famous aphorism to not trust anyone over 30. And apparently none of these kids imagined they'd ever be over 30, right? Because it's Peter Pan, and it was just, Anyhow, so of course, those of them who made it past and survived the LSD and the leaping off the cliffs thinking they could fly and whatever else it was, and self-examination and primal screaming, and I could go on, eventually turn into 7-year-olds. And what was it about their imaginal life that whispered to them that this is a proper outcome? Demise and diminishment and being demeaned in some fashion. So the conspiracy is insane, frankly. Now you have a situation where people of that age group are insisting at being at their own wakes. And I hear this pretty routinely, and they imagine that I'm going to be their ally in this thing. And I said, you understand what wake means, don't you? A wake is a consequence, not a cause. So how does a wake happen? Answer is, you die. It's not really negotiable. So if you're there, it's many things, but it's not a wake. Certainly not your wake. And now we know why you want to be there. Because the truth of the matter is, you do not trust the willingness or the capacity or the instinct of people younger than you to bear you in mind and bear you along. So now you're even instructing them in your own, I can't even think of the word they use anymore. But anyway, the story which is you. You still want to write it. And you'll be doing it from the grave, probably. So it's an act of fundamental mistrust, which is deeply understandable, because in the rupturous relation between the generations, it's more than possible that young people will and continue to find older people to be like spent jet trash littering the landscape. No, literally. I mean, I have to tell you this, given the age that you would appear to me to be, that the darkness regarding the world that young people are in the process of inheriting now is unspeakably thick. And I don't think it's possible to overstate the resentment. And I don't think older people are hip to this, to be honest. And when it comes out, it's mannered for about 10 seconds. And then you find young people howling into the withered, recoiling face of someone who could easily be their grandmother or even older. And the propriety of that is obviously a challengeable thing. But the understandability of it, the sense of abject betrayal of people who took as long as they could and then retired from the fray and left it to the young people to sort out, global warming, just to throw one out there, and the sea of plastic in the Pacific and so on, And older people can't see the connection between the life that they lived, full of struggle as it may have been, and the world that they're passing over to young kids. They don't see it because they don't experience themselves personally as being on the take for most of their lifestyle lives. But they were, we were, and we remain so. This begins to answer the question about, is it virtually toxic between the generations? It's a big part of the Nights of Grief and Mystery show. It didn't start that way, but it's become, why? Because there's so many young kids that are coming to the show. It's amazing, and they're not coming for a rock and roll show, though they do get it, because that's the sensibility of what we're doing. But what they really get is a lament in almost an Old Testament sort of fashion, a kind of stately, sorrowful testimony to how things are. And honestly, I look at young people and they seem secretly relieved that they're not being sold another solution, that they're not being sold anything, that somebody is willing to sit alongside them and say, here's how this is what's come to pass.
I took this quote from a source but it does quote you. It says, Jenkinson believes that what modern people suffer from most is culture failure, amnesia of ancestry and deep family story, phantom or sham rites of passage, no instruction on how to live with each other or with the world around us, or with our dead, or with our history. What do you think has been core to the degradation of culture?
Oh, Lord. Plato didn't help.
That's a long time ago.
No, it isn't, actually.
Well,
not that long. Not that long, because ideas don't age. That's why they're not to be overly held in high regard. Because ideas, like even the idea of God, for example, doesn't get any age on it. It doesn't tarnish and wear as it properly should. So it's mysteriously not of this world. And usually that's used as a compliment, not of this world. But I find these things untrustworthy, you know. We have enough to contend with that's of this world, without inviting kind of the Eric von Däniken allegations, you know, about where it all came from. Well, I mean, speaking as a North American now, it's proper to limit my purview to that.
Okay.
We were founded by you folks. And when you came over, you left a lot behind. And you're inhabiting here what you left behind when you came over and turned into us. Okay? And you became supra-citizens of a non-existent something. I mean, we have a province in Canada called Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, just for starters. That tells you the trauma. I mean, the allegation is seeking a new life, opportunity, the whole American thing. New England, for God's sake. There's nothing new about England. You transplant it to the other side of the Atlantic. That doesn't make it new. And I've said in my school more than once, don't call it New England, folks, because you lose the scent. Call it England again. Now it's properly understood. Why, if you wanted a whole new everything, did you name every place you could with a name familiar from the old country? Just take that one. So what am I saying? I'm saying that North America is a European fantasy, and it remains so. Founded by fantasy driven, traumatized European people, okay? And the trauma was compounded by going because of what was left behind. And the principal loss amongst all the other ones, to my mind, is the cultural continuity that whispered to you what was to become of you after you died. Gone. Melting pot, and so on. No shared understanding of the fundaments of cultural life that give you your understanding of what life means. I have never heard this talked about in general cultural, historical consideration, you know. But there is such a thing as psychic trauma at the cultural level. And when you have a founding story that hides this from you and turns it into freedom fighters who the first thing they do when they get to the other side is to deny that freedom to the people that they meet and even question whether or not they're human. And these are people allegedly seeking after a deeper running human life. That's not what those people do. No. So you begin to see, no? So it's a kind of compound fracture masquerading as a foundation story, as a creation story. It's terrifying when you start visiting it. And this, you know, I basically crafted a school that hovers around the question of what is the authorized history of America? Now, what's the unauthorized history of America? The one that nobody seems to want to cop to, which is clearly enunciating itself now with the kind of wringing dry of the resource base and so on. I mean, people who love, you know, their lives and love freedom, and so they don't behave that way. Never did, though. See? So there's a lot to this stew. You can feel it, no?
Yeah.
And with all of that, I would say to you something strange, which is we're probably more older European than you are. And what I mean by that is, even though our accent doesn't sound like you at all, but our Europeanness stopped, freeze-framed, see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
As a consequence of the Middle Passage. And it didn't continue.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't turn into something else. It kind of stopped and grew so unsure of itself, it perched on a rock, under a cloak for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
While you continue to develop what constitutes Europe today, with all the chagrin that seems to be
Mm-hmm.
in this part of the world now. None of it visits itself upon us. And we fought in your wars and so on, yeah? But then we left again. And here's the thing. Do we think about you? All the time. Do you think about us? From what I've seen, never.
That's quite fascinating.
Mm.
What an interesting perspective.
Mm.
Huh. What's your ancestry, Stephen?
Well, I'm sitting in part of it,
Really?
I imagine. Yeah. These things are bad. I don't really want to do the ancestry.ca thing, the mouth swab and all that.
Yeah.
I would rather
either,
be
I have to say.
informed by it at a subtler level.
Okay.
And clearly I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take this at face value. The first time I took a teaching gig in Ireland, which was a mad thing to do. I mean, you don't go to Ireland and talk if you're not from there. It's just as a matter of respect. You just don't do it, Don't go to Africa to dance. That's what I'm saying? Okay.
Yeah.
But there I was, stupid, and I'm standing at the front of the room. I'm just about to begin, and there's an old woman at the back of the room who yells something to me, or at me, or about me, or all of that. And I couldn't make out what she said because my ear wasn't tuned to the accent yet. So I asked her to repeat herself, and she said, "Sure, you're Irish." That's what she yelled from the back. Now, if this had happened at home in Canada, everyone would have glared at her like, drawing attention to yourself. Who do you think you are? Very English response. Not one person looked back at her. You know what they did? All the Irish people in the room. They leaned forward and looked at me even more intently to see if they could see what she was seeing, you see.
Okay.
It was amazing. I never would have seen that at home. And I said to her, "What makes you say that?" And she said, "Well," like there was the most self-evident thing on the planet. She said, "Well, look at your head." So they just straight up claimed me right away because the other people looked at each other after she said the head thing. They went, "Yeah, go on then. We figured you out. Go on." There's not many places in the world I could go, materialize in front of people like that. And somebody just goes like this, "We'll be having you."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was absolutely heartbreaking, that I'd lived that long with no sense of that whatsoever. And I don't make it, I don't live there. I don't long after the place, but it is a kind of cardinal point in the compass of self-understanding that there is a people in this world who more than imagine me, somehow remember me. See, that's the other half of what I was telling you about the darkness, you see. That's there too, if people are willing to recognize you. It's astounding. It's across the generations, yeah. And a little bit in this part of the world too, I think, the other side of the Irish Sea there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in there, as far back as anybody is willing to know, at home, yeah.
That's so interesting.
Mm.
I'm going to start asking you some of my, what I would, I suppose, call set questions. They're the ones that I tend to always ask in interviews.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect you might have issue with the way in which some of them are perhaps
Doesn't
worded,
sound like me at all.
or their intention, but
Okay.
hopefully you can see through that.
Okay.
What do you feel is your purpose in life?
Do I only get one? I hope I have some choices in the matter.
Okay.
Well, part of this has to do with certain kind of native skills that seem to arise in you. But these things can be stillborn without remarkable encounters at very numinous times. I had those. So I was kind of ignited, you could say, as I went along. So whatever ability I had was employed. And God, I mean, that's an unspeakable bounty when those things happen together. You don't know it at the time because you're callow and you're young, right? And you claim to know yourself and things like this. I'm in full possession of my assignment. I can say that with no equivocation. I don't own the thing. I don't command it. But I'm informed by it. I have a band. This is ludicrous. I'm not a natural performing person. I'm shy. And it's disfiguring to stand like I did last night here in Edinburgh and for 2.5 hours proclaim, you know. But that's what happened. And it happens again. And I have a band who's willing to do it with me, all of whom are professional musicians in their own right. How to understand? Call a thing Nights of Grief and Mystery and imagine that people will pay to come when you're not saying, no more grief, no more mystery, come on in. You're not saying that. So I lived long enough. I mean, that's one thing that shouldn't be overlooked, you know. I was spared because there was a few times it was touch and go, and I've seen the shore, you know. And it doesn't make me skillful at anything, but it gives me a sense of urgency where it might be despair in others. And I treasure that urgency. And so, you know, so the gig's over at 11, right? And I'm not going back to the hotel, man. And I find myself sitting in one of your bars here, 2 o'clock in the morning, with about 15 young people who just don't want to go home. And I have the same feeling. That's one of the reasons I'm here now, is that I get to sit with people who are younger than me. And they just want to know that the whole thing's not worthless. But you can't say it. But what did the old man say, Leonard Cohen? He said, and I lift my glass to the awful truth that you can't reveal to the ears of youth, except to say it isn't worth a dime. And the whole damn place goes crazy twice. And it's once for the devil, and it's once for Christ. And the boss don't like these dizzy heights. So we're busted in the blinding lights of closing time. And I think that's the time we're in. And the innkeeper is shutting the inn. And we have to leave. And it's not going to continue. And the order that we were born to will survive my lifetime. If survive is a good word to describe something that shouldn't be there anymore. It may survive your lifetime, but sometime thereafter, the whole works will find its proper denouement. And I think the principal responsibility in a time like that is to witness the undoing of the thing. And I'm probably an early, let's say I'm an early canary in that coal mine. And when I stop singing, it will be one of the little signs that the toxicity is gathered when the silence comes amongst the people willing to know it, who are not addicted to solutions, but are willing to be witnesses instead. When the witnesses stop speaking, that's probably close to the tumble. It's just rather grim, for so early in the morning, but you asked me. I tell you this. So I'm in Phoenix, Arizona or somewhere. I'm at a bookstore. It was crazy. There's a lot of crystals in the bookstore. That's not good. Not my kind of place. It's like kryptonite for me. But anyway, that's where I was. And there's this guy in the front row, and he's just right like that. He doesn't even blink for 2.5 hours. At the end, he comes up to me and he says, I've been watching you very carefully. And I said, no kidding. I noticed that. And he said, I finally figured you out. I said, well, great. I had to come all the way to Phoenix to get figured out. What'd you come up with? And he said to me, you're a prophet. That's the word he used. And he said it without chagrin and without irony. He said, that's what you do. I can't disagree. But I said, don't tell anybody, because it's not a well-paying gig. And the fringe benefits are really questionable. So we'll just keep it between ourselves. But now I've told you, so that's what he said. I can't disagree, though.
How would you like to be remembered? What would you like your legacy to be?
Absolutely not up to me.
Okay.
I have no voice in that matter.
Mm-hmm.
My voice is now,
Mm-hmm.
and people will remember as they do, what they do, for their reasons, according to the times, and what I was able to come up with might constitute something useful. That's it.
Mm.
That's it. But I'm going to use a big word here. I trust the architecture of that, though I won't be a witness to its outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So even sitting here with you now is not me secretly trying to engineer the way by which I'll be officially recalled. You see?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
It's just to contribute to it. And then people choose as they will. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not my business. I, on the other hand, remember.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember. That's what you're hearing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I hope I've got time to shoehorn in this question, but having witnessed so many deaths yourself, what kind of imprint does that leave on one's psyche?
It can utterly traumatize you, and it does many people.
Mm-hmm.
Or it can give you an implacably enhanced instinct for being alive.
Mm.
Because you have a glimpse of what not alive is. Not the content of it, but the kind of the goneness of it. And I have that all the time. So that has sent up this kind of little wild rose of longing inside me. And I'm going to say something that sounds very counterintuitively, that I long for life now, having been exposed to the death of so many fellow humans.
Mm-hmm.
You say, but you are alive. Well, why would you long for it? Well, there's the mystery. Mm-hmm. That me being alive doesn't extinguish my longing.
Mm-hmm.
It's extinguished most of my desires, I'll be honest with you, but not my longing, which is an entirely different order of kind of, emotive and existential life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thrilled about the deal in a general way. And I will be aggrieved when, the last curtain, I'm not excited about it. Okay. And I don't trust people who say that either.
Yeah.
I like this deal, man. I like sitting in this house with you this morning, and I like the fact that I'm getting in a coach in 20 minutes and driving to Bristol and got a show tomorrow night. I love it. Mm-hmm. I love being alive. But that's where my love comes from now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm 5 minutes to my midnight, you see. And it can be like this.
Yeah.
You don't have to go rancorous and belligerent and with somebody screaming in your ear, do not go quietly into that good night. Yeah, Dylan Thomas, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's no obligation to be kicking and screaming like an infant that you didn't get your way. Mm-hmm. Did you draw breath? Were you alive long enough to realize you were drawing breath? Then you're in the bonus round, man, no matter how old you are. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not very tolerant in these matters, you can see.
How do you define success?
I don't. I try to succeed. What does that mean? I don't know. I try to be faithful to what I've seen. I try to remember. I try to remember to go home, to reacquire my farm status, to reintroduce myself to the animals. But I'm not a farmer anymore because I'm out here too often, So I've already had to let that go. so much for my dream for how it would be towards the end. You know, I'm mysteriously on the road. My good fortune has become my habit. I'm all for it. I'm really a child of fortune. I lived long enough to be born that way. Yeah. My mother wouldn't recognize what I just said because it was a very hard time in the early days, you know. But there's no hero's journey here. There's nothing heroic, nothing exemplary. I just got a chance to be around the real thing when I was young, and I lost all my idle possibilities, and urgency became my responsibility. And then in the death trade, well, the circuitry was completed then, because when I saw other people's demise and saw the belligerence with which they came to it, I saw my own, of course, many times. And this is not an affliction. But you have to work, though. You know, the deal comes down to this: bless, work, repeat. Yeah.
I suspect you might have an issue with this question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I didn't receive it directly, but I read it.
Okay.
It was an interview with Leonard Cohen a long time ago. And they said to him, you have a lot of aspiring writers and so on and musicians in touch with you? All the time, he said. And did they ask you for advice? He said, they do, frequently. He said, what do you tell them? And Cohen says to him, duck. Duck.
Duck.
That's the advice I give. He said, I don't know if I duck, but I take the understanding, you know, that there's no merit in being rigidly like that bowsprit on the friggin' Titanic, you know, like that stupid movie thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no merit in that. No, if you can't, like this, you'll be the early casualty of your own certainty, right? You have to cultivate the capacity for ambivalence, right? And not be obliged to collapse into a certain premature and indefensible certainty in the face of these contending possibilities of life. See? So, somewhere in there, the notion that you have no obligation to a unified field theory called yourself, I think that was very valuable. I don't think anybody ever said it to me, but I think I saw examples. I mean, the man I was with, he never asked for permission, but he would on occasion, in a very profound way, ask for forgiveness. And that is, that's a royal feast if you get in on that as a young person, to see somebody roll that way. Yeah.
If you had the opportunity to speak to your 20-year-old self, what would you say?
I think I do all the time. Although the 20-year-old self has more to say and is not so inclined to listen, you know. So I probably wouldn't. I would say, you again. God, you're so sure. You know, and of course people listening to this say, are you kidding? Listen how you talk. You don't go, I think, at the end of every sentence, or who knows, or anything. That's true, I don't have those qualifiers. But this is me brailing my way towards what you're asking me about. The fact that I might sound sure of myself is an occupational hazard of being asked things. Because who wants to hear, I don't know, at the end of every thought? Come on.
So is the certainty an act?
It's not an act. It's not an act any more than putting on shoes when it's cold out is an act.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Okay, but they're not you.
Yeah.
And your certainties are just, they're useful. But then take them off already when they've outlived their reasons, you see. Yeah, and underneath there's not more certainty. Underneath that is the unnecessity of certainty. Yeah.
Yeah, love that. If you could change anything in the world, what would it be and why?
I'm not seduced by megalomania at all.
Okay.
Really and truly. I don't think that's a place humans should occupy. If I could change something in the world. Well, look, but you only have one place. You don't occupy the world, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion that you can exercise some kind of grand vision and then accurate, no.
Mm-hmm.
No, all of your life ways are local, specific, particular, you know. And that's the only place you operate.
Yeah.
Even sitting here with you now, that's all this is. So it's a kind of redundant question because it's the only place that any changing occurs anyway, you know. So I'm responsible, I guess, for 5'7" worth of trouble. That's all. And I try to inflect the trouble in some fashion so that it can outgrow its old habits and turn into an old person's mischievous unwillingness to comply.
Okay. But I suppose your influence can be sort of exercised vicariously through other people. So there's this kind of cliche quote, be the change that you want to see in the world, or, the way in which you show up in life can have a ripple effect outwards.
Does have.
So you think there's merit in that?
Oh, listen. So, excuse me, that's a little strong. Here's the thing. We have this word awake in the English language, right? Everybody thinks they know what it means because we use it as the opposite of sleep, or if you're in a kind of enlightenment circles. But investigate the word and it will not betray you. It's very simple. It's an old English word, so the A in front functions differently than if it were a Greek or a Latin word. And in Old English, it's a preposition, basically. So it locates. Okay, that's the A. It means of, or sort of pertaining to, or constituent to, something like this. And then the root word wake, we use this word. It's the thing that you make when you go through water. It's the thing that you make as a result of dying. It's very interesting that it's the same word for both of those things. You reassemble the word, and the condition of being awake has nothing to do with aha. It means this, to be gathered into the web of consequence that emanated from everything you did and everything you didn't do, and what you said, what you should have said but didn't, and so and so and so. So it's not a recipe for being unfettered. It's quite the opposite. It's to be tethered to your times and to the consequences that became the story that people remember you by, if they remember you at all. That's our responsibility, is to proceed bound to what binds us, if you could put it that way. And to fail to do so is sociopathic. To be self-initiating, self-concerned and so on, that's sociopathic. It's extraordinarily hazardous to the general well-being, whatever's left of the general well-being after several generations of experimenting with, self-development. Yeah. I think I might have to go.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I just want to say, Stephen, an enormous thank you for your wisdom, your insights, and it's been an absolute honour and pleasure speaking with you.
You're very kind. These are mostly allegations in lieu of the wisdom that I haven't managed yet.
Well.
But cheers, thank you so much too.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay.